The room was chaos. The sharp monotone of a flatline pierced through the walls of the private hospital suite, drowning out the desperate commands of doctors in white coats. 20 of them surrounded the bed, each a specialist flown in at a moment's notice. Their faces glistened with sweat under the harsh fluorescent lights, their voices colliding as they shouted orders, swapped syringes, and adjusted machines that refused to obey. On the bed lay Jonathan Reeves, a man whose fortune could buy almost anything except a heartbeat. His chest lay frighteningly still, his skin ashen, his empire hanging by a thread with every passing second. The world outside knew him as untouchable, but here he was, reduced to silence, his billions useless against the cruel mathematics of mortality. Every second that passed wasn't just time slipping away, it was a lifetime of unfinished business, broken promises, and secrets he thought he'd buried. And then, through the tangle of wires and the desperate voices of the men in charge, another figure stood frozen. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her uniform marked her as invisible, the kind of person powerful men never noticed, quiet, unnoticed, yet always present. Maria, his housekeeper of nearly 20 years, had been asked to deliver a bag of fresh clothes to his private wing. But when she heard the panic echoing down the hallway, something drew her closer, something more than just concern for her employer. She pressed herself against the doorway, watching, her heart hammering in rhythm with the machine's alarm, and then she saw it, something small, something so painfully obvious that 20 doctors, for all their training and brilliance, had overlooked completely. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what Maria noticed that night wasn't only about saving Jonathan Reeves's life, it would unravel a chain of events that no one in that room, neither the doctors nor Jonathan himself, was prepared for. A discovery that could save a man's life, but also tear apart everything he had built. Leonard Harrington was the kind of man whose name carried weight in every boardroom in America. A self-made billionaire who rose from the grit of Detroit's factory floors to the gleaming towers of Wall Street, he embodied the dream many envied but few dared to chase. His businesses spanned industries, energy, banking, real estate, and his influence stretched across oceans. Reporters called him relentless, partners called him brilliant, and rivals called him ruthless. Yet behind the polished marble of his mansion and the endless accolades, Leonard lived in quiet isolation. Success had made him powerful, but it had also made him cold. His closest companions weren't family or friends, but contracts, lawyers, and the fleeting company of people who needed something from him. The image he projected to the world was one of strength. But in the quiet hours, when no cameras were around, Leonard Harrington was a man profoundly, painfully alone. It was during one of those quiet seasons that his body began to betray him. At first it was nothing more than fatigue, sluggish mornings that stretched into sleepless nights, subtle pains that came and went. Doctors called it stress, the kind of wear and tear expected from a man who carried entire industries on his shoulders. But then came the tremors. His hands, once steady in signing deals worth billions, now shook uncontrollably when lifting a glass of water. His speech grew slurred at times, his memory unreliable. He was admitted to hospitals in New York, Boston, even flown discreetly to Switzerland, where the most expensive specialists waited. And yet with every test, every scan, every whispered consultation behind closed doors, the same conclusion was reached. They didn't know. Leonard's body was failing him, but the illness had no name, no clear diagnosis, and no cure. For a man who had always bought answers, the uncertainty was unbearable. Around him, the people closest to his fortune circled like vultures sensing weakness. His children, 3 heirs born into wealth, were less interested in their father's suffering than in what his decline meant for their inheritance. Emily, the eldest, polished her public image as the dutiful daughter while quietly maneuvering to secure control of the family trust. His son, Richard, had spent years burning through money and credibility, his eyes fixed on his father's empire as his last chance at redemption. And then there were the cousins, nephews, and distant relatives, people who hadn't spoken to Leonard in decades but suddenly appeared, offering sympathy thinly veiled with expectation. Even his business rivals leaned closer, each waiting for news that the Titan had finally stumbled. In every corner of his world, Leonard could feel it. People weren't praying for his recovery. They were preparing for his absence. The mansion itself became a stage for this quiet war. Long corridors once filled with art and silence now echoed with the measured footsteps of lawyers and advisors. Staff whispered in the kitchen about his worsening health, trading rumors about whether he had weeks, months, or maybe just days left. Journalists camped at the edges of his estate, hungry for leaks. And Leonard, confined to his private quarters, fought his battle not only with the illness in his body, but with the realization that the life he had built, a life defined by power and wealth, might be remembered more for the chaos it unleashed in his absence than for anything he achieved. Even in his weakest moments, though, he refused to show defeat. To the doctors, to his children, to the press, Leonard remained stoic. But in truth, each day was a gamble. It was in this fragile and uncertain state that another presence quietly wove through his home. She didn't appear in the newspapers, she wasn't invited to family meetings, and her name never appeared on the endless legal documents being drafted. Maria, the housekeeper who had worked in his mansion for nearly 2 decades, was the only person who had witnessed Leonard both at the height of his power and in the depth of his decline. She polished the floors his heirs argued upon. She arranged the dinners that went untouched when Leonard's appetite vanished. She folded the clothes he no longer had the strength to wear. To most she was invisible, a shadow in the hallways. But unlike the doctors, the lawyers, and even his own family, Maria was present. She noticed things not because she was trained to, but because she cared enough to look. And soon what she would see, what no one else could, would change everything. The specialists moved like a rotating army through Leonard Harrington's private hospital wing. Each morning brought a new strategy: experimental drugs from Europe, high-dose steroids, oxygen therapies, even whispers of untested procedures designed for military officers and heads of state. But every treatment ended the same way: failure. His condition would briefly stabilize, only to collapse again by nightfall. The doctors spoke in hushed tones, each reluctant to admit the truth. They were running out of options. For Leonard, a man accustomed to winning, every injection that didn't work felt like another nail sealing a coffin. The once iron grip of his willpower was slipping, and each hour felt like a countdown, not just to the end of his life, but to the unraveling of everything he had built. For if he were to die, his empire, his fortune, his legacy would fall into the wrong hands. Inside the Harrington estate, tension thickened like smoke. His children rarely visited their father's bedside except for appearances, yet their arguments filled the air of the mansion. Emily insisted on private control of the trust, claiming Richard was reckless and unfit. Richard accused Emily of manipulation, of trying to push him aside when he had every right to their father's name. Meetings with attorneys stretched late into the night, documents rewritten again and again as Leonard's pulse weakened. Even the extended family gathered in shadowed corners, their conversations laced with greed and entitlement. To outsiders, it looked like they were preparing for his recovery. But to those inside, the truth was undeniable. They weren't discussing how to keep Leonard alive. They were planning how to divide his absence. And in those moments of whispered betrayal, Maria passed quietly with trays of untouched meals, her presence never acknowledged. She noticed things the others ignored: the untouched glass of water left by Leonard's bed, the uneaten fruit that sat until it spoiled, the way his hands trembled when no doctors were looking. Maria had seen him as a young, proud man, demanding and untouchable. Now she watched him fade, a prisoner in his own body, while the people closest to him fought over scraps of a future he hadn't yet lost. To Maria, Leonard was not just an employer. He was a man, fragile and frightened, clinging to dignity while the world circled for his crown. But she knew better than to speak. Her silence was survival. Her role was to remain invisible. And yet, invisibility gave her a power no one suspected, the ability to see what others, blinded by greed, refused to notice. But Leonard wasn't just sick, he was being watched. Strange visitors began to appear late at night, men in tailored suits who weren't doctors and weren't family. They carried briefcases, whispered with his lawyers, and left before dawn. The staff speculated, were these investors plotting a takeover? Were enemies circling while Leonard lay helpless? Maria saw them too, her eyes lingering as they disappeared into his study with doors locked behind them. And with each passing night, the weight in her chest grew heavier. Leonard's illness might have weakened his body, but something else, something more deliberate, seemed to be tightening its grip around him. One night, after clearing a tray of untouched food, Maria paused outside the corridor leading to Leonard's private quarters. The doctors had gone, his children were absent. The house was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that makes every sound feel amplified. As she turned to leave, she noticed a shadow move across the crack beneath his door. Slowly, she stepped closer, her heart racing. Through the faint opening, she saw a figure bending over Leonard's bed. For a moment, she thought it was a doctor, until she noticed the gloved hands, the small vial being prepared, and the way Leonard's head lolled weakly to the side. Maria froze. What she was witnessing wasn't treatment. It was something else entirely. And, in that single moment, everything she thought she knew about the man she worked for, and the people around him, was shattered. Leonard Harrington's story was once celebrated as the quintessential American dream. Born in a cramped Detroit neighborhood, he grew up in a house where the roof leaked in winter and the furnace broke more often than it worked. His father worked double shifts at a factory. His mother cleaned schools by night. From those beginnings, Leonard vowed never to be poor again. He clawed his way through college with scholarships and night jobs, graduating with a degree in finance and an ambition too large for the small world he came from. In his 20s, he took risks others called reckless, borrowing money, investing in volatile markets, refusing to accept defeat. By his 40s, he was one of the wealthiest men in the country. But behind every dollar was a choice, and with each choice, something was left behind. The empire he built came at the cost of everything else that might have made him whole. As Leonard's wealth grew, so too did the distance between him and those who once mattered most. He missed birthdays, funerals, anniversaries. The wife who once held his hand through sleepless nights finally let go, tired of being second to boardrooms and balance sheets. His children grew up in mansions, but rarely in his presence, learning to equate love with material comfort, not time spent together. Friends from his youth, men who once shared beers and cheap laughter, disappeared one by one. Leonard told himself it was the price of success, that someday when he slowed down, he would rebuild those bridges. But slowing down never came. His life became a treadmill of endless acquisitions, each victory leaving him emptier than before. By the time his body began to fail him, Leonard Harrington had everything money could buy, and almost nothing that truly mattered. Far away from his glittering towers and endless fortune, Maria's life had been marked by quiet struggle. Born in a rural town, she grew up in a family that never had enough but always shared what little they could. Her father worked the fields, her mother sewed clothes for neighbors. Maria learned early that dignity wasn't measured by wealth, but by kindness, humility, and the ability to endure. When tragedy struck, her father's sudden passing, she left school to support her family. Years later, a chance led her to work in Leonard's mansion. To him, she was simply another staff member. To the world, she was invisible. Yet, beneath her modest uniform and calloused hands was a heart defined by compassion. While Leonard's children measured life in stock prices and assets, Maria measured it in meals shared, prayers whispered, and the rare moments when she could ease another's burden. The contrast between their lives could not have been sharper. Leonard sat at the top of the world, commanding industries, owning skyscrapers, and bending the wills of governments. Maria scrubbed the floors of those same towers, her voice seldom heard, her presence barely acknowledged. He had power, but lacked peace. She lacked wealth, but held something far rarer: humanity. Their worlds should never have intersected, yet fate had tied them together inside the walls of his mansion. While his own blood plotted over inheritance and strangers schemed for control, Maria was the only one who saw the man behind the empire, a man unraveling, clinging to life in silence, and soon she would notice what others ignored. A truth hidden not in medical charts or legal documents, but in plain sight. A truth connecting these two lives, one of wealth and one of humility, that was darker than anyone expected. For weeks, Maria kept her silence, moving like a shadow through the estate, while doctors clashed over theories and Leonard's family quarreled over inheritances. But silence gives space for observation, and Maria's eyes caught what others dismissed. It began with something small: a tray of food left by Leonard's bed. Each night she noticed he would nibble at the fruit or sip from the juice provided, and almost without fail, within hours, his condition would worsen. His tremors spiked, his breathing grew shallow, and the alarms of machines filled the room. Maria wasn't a doctor, but she had raised children, cared for the elderly, and seen the patterns of illness up close. This wasn't random. This was cause and effect. Something inside that food, something meant to nourish, was instead poisoning him. And while 20 experts in lab coats pored over data, she was the only one who saw the pattern clearly. Her suspicions grew one afternoon when she cleared Leonard's untouched plate. She noticed the faintest residue, powdery, bitter-smelling, settling at the bottom of his glass. She paused, lifting it carefully, the scent unfamiliar, yet sharp enough to sting her nose. No one else had seen it. The doctors were focused on charts, the children busy with their lawyers. Maria, standing alone in the quiet of that room, realized with a chill running down her spine. This was no illness. This was interference. The question wasn't just what was in his food, but who had placed it there. And as her mind ran through the names, doctors, nurses, family, she realized the most likely answer was also the most terrifying. Someone in his own circle wanted him gone. That night, Maria stayed longer in the hallway, her instincts pushing her to watch. Through the door's narrow crack, she caught sight of Richard, Leonard's son, leaning over his father's bed. His face carried no trace of grief, only calculation, as he adjusted a glass on the nightstand. Maria's breath caught as she saw his hand linger near the bottle before he slipped it into his pocket and walked away. For anyone else, it would have seemed harmless. But Maria remembered the bitter scent, the residue, the sudden declines after each meal. This wasn't negligence. It was intent. The betrayal was no longer a whisper of possibility. It was standing before her in plain sight. Richard Harrington, Leonard's own blood, wasn't waiting for his father's fortune. He was ensuring it. She was no doctor, but she saw the truth that 20 experts overlooked. And with that truth came a terrible burden. What was she supposed to do? Maria was a housekeeper, not a whistleblower. Her word meant nothing compared to the polished testimonies of doctors and the weight of Leonard's powerful heirs. If she spoke, she risked not only dismissal, but retaliation. Who would believe the woman who cleaned floors over the son of a billionaire? And yet, how could she remain silent, knowing each hour brought Leonard closer to death? The decision clawed at her, the fear pressing in from all sides, and when she finally tried to speak up, no one believed her. When Maria finally spoke, her words were quiet but urgent. She told the head physician about the residue in the glass, the sudden decline after meals, the shadow she had seen in the night. The doctor barely looked up from his clipboard. With a patronizing smile, he reminded her she wasn't trained, that stress and fatigue could cloud judgment. He thanked her for concern, but insisted the team had everything under control. When she turned to Leonard's children, the response was harsher. Emily laughed outright, calling her paranoid. Richard glared, his voice sharp. "You're a maid, not a doctor. Stay in your place." Each attempt to raise the alarm was crushed beneath disbelief and mockery. Maria had risked her job to speak, and instead of saving Leonard, she found herself silenced, dismissed as nothing more than a servant who had overstepped her boundaries. But truth doesn't vanish just because it's ignored. The evidence built each day, small details only Maria saw. Another powdery residue at the bottom of a glass. A sudden dip in Leonard's breathing, only hours after Richard's late-night visits. She began keeping quiet notes, times, dates, patterns, scribbled in the margins of an old housekeeping logbook. Every entry added weight to her conviction. She was terrified, but conviction grew stronger than fear. If no one would believe her words, she would need to act. And when the moment came, it wasn't with speeches or confrontation. It was with courage in the shadows. Late one evening, as Leonard lay gasping, machines struggling to stabilize his heartbeat, Maria entered his room under the pretense of tidying. On the nightstand sat a fresh glass of juice, untouched. She picked it up, her hand trembling, and quietly poured it into the sink. Replacing it, she brought water directly from the kitchen, untampered, clean. Hours passed, and for the first time in weeks, Leonard's vitals steadied. His color returned faintly, his breathing evened. Doctors marveled at the unexpected improvement, while Maria stood silently in the corner, knowing the truth. It wasn't their medicine. It wasn't their expertise. It was one simple act of defiance from the woman no one noticed. The billionaire who trusted no one now owed everything to the person he ignored the most. And this leaves us with a question only you can answer. What would you have done in her place? Speak up and risk everything, or stay silent, knowing the truth would die with him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The truth could only stay hidden for so long. Maria's quiet defiance, her careful notes, and her relentless vigilance began to form a picture that even the most skeptical could no longer dismiss. One night, when Leonard's vitals unexpectedly improved after she discarded his drink, she gathered the courage to show the head physician her logbook. At first, he waved it away, until he compared her dates to the medical charts. The pattern was undeniable. Every sudden decline followed Richard's visits. Every unexplained crash coincided with meals or drinks that Maria had tracked. The doctor's face drained of color as realization took root. And when security cameras were finally checked, the evidence became irrefutable. Richard's betrayal was no longer suspicion, it was fact. The confrontation erupted like a storm, doctors stunned, staff whispering, and Leonard's family standing frozen as the mask of loyalty was torn away. Leonard survived that night. Barely. His body was still frail, his voice weak, but his eyes opened with clarity he hadn't shown in months. For the first time, he saw past the polished lies and empty words surrounding him. His children, his rivals, the countless people who claimed to care, had failed him. The empire he built could not save him. The doctors could not save him. The loyalty of blood had nearly destroyed him. And yet, standing in the shadows, trembling with fear but unbroken, was the one person who had refused to give up on him. Maria, the housekeeper he had overlooked for decades, had risked everything to keep him alive. In that moment, Leonard understood something his billions had never taught him. Real loyalty could not be bought, and true courage often comes from those the world refuses to see. In the weeks that followed, Leonard Harrington's recovery was slow but steady. The man who had once commanded empires with an iron will now sat quietly by the window, humbled by the fragility of his own life. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to reflect, not on profits or conquests, but on the people he had failed to notice. Among them, Maria stood foremost in his mind. She had saved him when no one else would. She had seen the truth when experts were blind, and she had risked everything with nothing to gain except the knowledge that a human life was worth protecting. Leonard, once cold and unreachable, softened. He spoke fewer words, but each carried gratitude. For a man who had trusted no one, he now found trust in the most unexpected place, the housekeeper he had ignored for nearly 20 years. He could have rewarded her with money, but Leonard knew that wealth alone could never measure her courage. Instead, he restored her dignity in a way the world could not ignore. At a press conference announcing his return, he did something unheard of. Before the cameras, before his heirs, before his rivals, he spoke her name. He told the truth of what she had done. And in that moment, Maria was no longer invisible. She was recognized, honored, lifted from the shadows into the light of respect she had always deserved. What he gave her was not just compensation, it was recognition, dignity, and a place in history that no amount of money could erase. For Leonard, it was the beginning of a transformation. For Maria, it was proof that courage, even in silence, can change destinies. In the end, true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in compassion, courage, and truth. Leonard Harrington had nearly lost his life, but in being saved, he gained something far greater: perspective. His empire might one day crumble, his fortune might fade, but the lesson Maria gave him would remain. A legacy not of greed or betrayal, but of loyalty, humility, and the reminder that the smallest voices can hold the greatest power. And now, we turn the question to you. If this story touched your heart, hit the like button. It helps us share more stories like this. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales every week. What do you think? Was justice truly served?